FreeBooksTube is glad to produce, publish and offer Fear Your Hidden Power by Manly P. Hall. The problem is one which, but most of you will never be directly involved with. Well, during many years in which I have been a kind of last resort for troubled people, I've had much too frequent contact with this situation, and I think it's only fair that it should be reported and recorded and preserved for those who need it or have a mind to accept it. We all know that the human being is at a great advantage in the presence of a mystery. We are able to handle the everyday occurrences with a certain amount of skill because we honestly believe that the adversaries that we face are known to us. We can measure our skill against theirs, and if need arises, we can run away and continue the struggle at some other time. But in a mystery, we are totally disoriented. Which person cannot function too much or too often in the presence of intangible factors? Even a little mystery arising in a family can prove to be most disorienting. Secrets are dangerous things because we have no way of fighting them. We have very little way of fighting gossips and poison pens and anonymous letters. They all involve certain moments of mystery. Things are intangible, we cannot face them and have it out. From the earliest time, man had more courage in the day than he had in the night. Even when he had his own private cave, this cave was a lot safer, as far as he was concerned, in the daylight than it was in darkness. After he built houses, put locks on his doors, and barred his windows, he was still happier in the daytime than he was at night. Because at night, perhaps old boards would creak or something of that nature, man became afraid again. In our modern scientific life, man is afraid once more because he is afraid of formulas which he cannot understand. He is afraid of tremendous energies that he can't cope with. They are all mysteries to him. We are a little bit afraid of the minds of other people. You do not know what they're thinking about. We are afraid that they are perhaps planning some secret exploitation of our resources, whatever these things may be. Long ago, man passed through a terrible nightmare, a nightmare of secrets and of darkness and of magic intensified by a great common belief in the power of evil. The demons lurked in darkness at old crossroads, the fear of spirit possession, the fear of excommunication, of the witch-mint, and all these things weighed very heavily upon some of our ancestors. They really never knew how to cope with them. They died as much of terrors as of the common ailments of the flesh. So, when today we observe the long shadow of mystery reaching into our private lives, there is a certain anxiety. We are not able to cope with the problem effectively, and there are certain questions that I think we all must ask. It has been rather well established by ESP researches that there are possibilities of a certain kind of clairvoyance. The thought transference is very probably a reality and will sometime be standardized or at least far better understood than it is now. We are more or less convinced that verbal answers are within the reasonable probability of things, and many different extrasensory potentials are being experienced within ourselves to a degree. These discoveries are important and useful and helpful, and perhaps they will support our basic idealism, our conviction that the universe is a far greater and more important place than we have ever learned that it was. But there's always this little lurking problem. So, we can put it in the very simple words of one individual who spent quite a sum of money to have mental absent treatments. This individual was very anxious that a certain person that they knew would change their way of life. So, they hired someone, a practitioner, to go to work on the issue. And after a reasonable length of time, the object of all this attention did make some changes in their way of life, including a will in favor of the individual who came to me. Well, this sounded like higher mentalism doing a pretty good job. You would get testimonials very easily for such procedures. But suddenly, the person who came to me broke out in a cold sweat. This was a little problem. If they could change another individual and get a will in their favor, was it possible that some other individual could change them? While we were out mentally dominating somebody else, could it be that somebody else was trying to mentally dominate us? Do these processes work both ways? Is it possible for us to send our thoughts to change the life of someone else, put someone else in their thought and change our lives? If we want to make someone else do something they do not want to do, can they return the favor in kind? It is one of these things in which it was a good rule, but it shouldn't work both ways. Each person feels that he has a right to change others, but he doesn't like the thought that somebody might be secretly trying to change him. The moment we get into this problem, our freedom of action, our freedom of thought, all these things evaporate. Where will it begin? Where will it end? If one person can influence, so can 50 or 100 or 1,000. If one individual can cause another person to have a loss out of revenge or out of spite, can somebody else cause us to have a loss the same way? Like the old bruja, if we can pray our enemy to death, cannot enemies pray us to death? It just doesn't look so well when we open this mysterious door. Between the commonplace and the unusual, we step immediately into a word, first of all, a region which we know nothing about. We have no background in our own experience to cope with these intangibles. All we have to work with is a tremendous tendency to fantasy in ourselves, an imagination that can get out of hand, even with the commonplace, let alone the unusual. The mind that has very little foundation in any form of essential courage or fact or reasonableness, with a nature, therefore, that is lacking in most of the requirements of prudence and common sense. It is very easy to get deeper and deeper into a world of wonders that can change gradually and inevitably into a world of terrors. It is a rather dangerous situation for the person to suddenly leave behind the landmark that he has and knows and depends upon and sail out into an uncharted ocean of mystical impossibilities. My experience with this type of situation is that 99 out of 100 land in shipwreck before it's over. They might be able to handle the situation with some dignity if they were very wise or very poised, very well integrated. But whoever heard of an individual very poised and very well integrated, whoever got mixed up in these things? 9/10 of the potential victims of their own foolishness in this direction find themselves neurotic. They are persons whose lives have been, one way or another, unhappy, frustrated, pressure-ridden. They are not thirst dollars, they are not deeply thoughtful individuals, trained thinkers. They're persons who have drifted through the years studying a little of this and a little of that, joining this organization and then that organization, and most of them in trouble from the mere process of pranic joining. So many of these organizations threaten their members that if the member leaves for any reason, some dark and mysterious curse will fall upon them. This is enough to recollect immediately. The individual living in the 20th century still has the old primordial instinct to be afraid of curses and afraid of the evil thoughts of others. The moment we give these evil thoughts a large place in our own thinking, we can begin to feel these thoughts moving in on us. Our lives can become haunted by the myriad fears that arise from negative speculations about the unknown. These speculations didn't rise as the result of a certain interest in metaphysical matters. The individual would probably immediately consider the possibility that he's mentally ill, but if this is part of some strange mystical procedure, he doesn't think of himself as ill at all. He thinks of himself as illuminated. He thinks of himself as having reached new dimensions of consciousness, but then these new dimensions of consciousness begin to go to work on him. Before it's over, we realize that he has simply used this strange unknown as a catalyst for his own neuroses. So we can't too strongly recommend that persons be extremely cautious in trying to explore areas where their knowledge is simply insufficient. Now, knowledge in itself is a very good thing. We should know about everything, even things we do not really agree with or even things we do not want to believe. We should know about them. We should never assume for a moment that ignorance is an asset. There is a great deal of difference, however, between understanding the theories and practices of certain beliefs and the effort to dabble with them ourselves. There is no reason why we shouldn't understand the theories behind transcendentalism if it intrigues us, but there are many reasons why we shouldn't dabble with it. Especially, this is true where we actually haven't even any very solid groundwork in theory. It's one thing, perhaps, to make some modest experimentation after 20 years of careful study in which we really have done our own study, not simply taken somebody else's word for it, read a few ancient books or modern reprints. But to approach these things haphazardly, in a strange childlike faith that somehow we are going to be protected from our own foolishness, this simply does not pay off, except in terms of tragedy. Now, one thing that's not too important at this stage of our thinking is whether all this weird and wonderful world is a reality or simply a psychological condition within ourselves. Whether all this magic is a psychic phenomenon or a psychological phenomenon is not perhaps so important at this point. Regardless of which it is, it has the same effect on us, and when we add to this a certain amount of coincidence, a certain amount of inevitable fortuity, we can build up a pretty strong case for things that can be very difficult if we're not careful. For example, we know that the average person who doesn't feel well will likely enough feel better tomorrow. A very large percentage of symptoms, as every doctor knows, are not very valid. That's one of the reasons why maybe a couple of aspirin tablets or something of that kind will permanently remove aggravating symptoms which have no real essential foundation in a true bodily condition or warning. A little fatigue, perhaps a little eye strain, a little tension, and we have a headache. We relax, the headache takes care of itself and simply disappears. Now, in the same way, for hundreds of years, medicine made use of the bread pill and other simple formulas, the purpose of which was simply to cause the patient to believe that he had been given important medications, and the patient, completely relieved of his anxiety, got well. He didn't really need any medication at all. This is also the reason why so many patent devices during the middle of the last century were so successful, like the magnetic horse blanket and things of this nature. This magnetic blanket had absolutely no magnetism whatever associated with it, but thousands of people reported amazing and miraculous cures. They also announced tremendous results from various herb concoctions and swamp root preparations, the only medicinal element being alcohol. But naturally, it gave a certain note of encouragement, especially if the doses were large and frequent. The individual, therefore, if left to his own devices, will very often feel better, at least temporarily. But if an individual who has nothing wrong with him except perhaps a little anxiety mechanism feels that he is being treated for this, that some other person is sending him powerful vibrations, he gets feeling better very quickly, just like he used to get feeling better on Peruna. There was a certain parallel here, and we come finally to really believe that people are doing a lot of these things for us or to us when we're really doing them to or for ourselves. But coincidence also comes in and plays quite a part in some of these things I've seen. And those are wild. We come to the conclusion that thoughts are very, very vital things, that we only have to send a few thoughts around, and the whole face of common sense is altered. This goes on for a time, and what ends up then is finally the individual becomes seriously ill with something, and perhaps by neglecting it in the hope of some other form of magical cure, reaches a part where he cannot be saved at all. These things have their mysterious negative factors that we have to watch for constantly. Because faith is a wonderful thing, but when it's put in the wrong place and the wrong things are believed in, it can be very costly in terms of health and happiness in life. One of the simplest examples of what might be termed magic that man has used from the very earliest time is prayer. Now, prayer can be a very wonderful thing for the human being. It has a tremendous potential for good, and yet so few of us can use prayer unselfishly. It is so hard for us to really be sincere even in this. If we really believe that prayer is of power, then this power becomes the basis of a temptation of some nature. Power promises us things. It's very hard to believe in power without trying to use it to our own advantage or to the disadvantage of someone else. I know people who spent many years praying that misfortunes would come to another person. How we can do a thing like this in the name of God is difficult to understand, but it happens every day. We also have a great number of prayers in which the individual is asking God to take care of things he should be taking care of himself, not waiting for the infinite to step in and correct a commonplace situation that we should all be able to handle. Therefore, we have prayer, which essentially is a relationship with God, transformed into a kind of basis of a new kind of old age pension or social security. Prayer becomes the basis of the gratification of very commonplace desires. We don't realize we are misusing it. We have the best intentions in the world, but when we start to pray that somebody else is going to let us foreclose a mortgage on them, we're in dangerous ground. We're in very dangerous ground. And when someone stands up and testifies that as a result of prayer they've doubled their income, there's just a little doubt as to whether this is what prayer was intended for. Do we really have a right to assume that some spiritual force in nature, a force which has as its primary concern the achievement of ultimates, the great infinite patterns of things, should be supplicated every time we have a headache or every time we have an appetite or a desire which we feel needs gratification? This type of use seems to lead us away from the essential integrity of life. When we pray that somebody else shall be over-influenced in some way or another, what about the other person? What about the individual who lost money so that our income could be doubled? Did the universe turn on him for our benefit? Was our prayer a means of dishonestly acquiring that which did not belong to us? Most people won't even bother to ask the question. They don't care how it's fulfilled as long as they get what they want. But can we assume that the universe operates this way? And if we are willing to assume this, what happens to our own relationship with every problem of existence? The moment we take the honesty out of the universe anywhere, we take it out everywhere. Either there are principles and rules in this world or there are not. And if there are rules, we cannot break them, we shouldn't try. If there are no rules, then our entire ethical life collapses. We have no hope or reasonable expectation of any kind of good end or constructive purpose in our own existence. The old Greeks brought this question under consideration, and one of them asked Pythagoras how a man should pray. The old Greek replied, "Never pray for anything. Don't pray for the fulfillment of any desire, because if you pray hard enough, your desire may be fulfilled, and may be the destruction of you." In other words, we all know what we want, but only heaven knows what we need. When we begin to decide what we want and use various esoteric ways of getting what we want, we are defying that universal pattern which alone knows what we need. Therefore, it would appear that prayer has a function. It has a purpose. It has a reason, but that reason is not the fulfillment of commonplace desires. Prayer is a mystic relationship with life. It is man finding the source of his strength in a regular communion with the heavenly power that creates all things. Nearly all ancient prayers were hymns of praise, hymns of thankfulness and gratitude. It was very rare indeed to find in ancient or primitive prayers anyone asking for anything. It was the person simply stating in simple conviction his realization of the wonders of life, the blessings he enjoyed, the wonderful privileges that he had. He gave thanks to heaven for the sun, the moon, the earth, the seasons, and the harvest. He was not asking, he was thanking. And prayers of this nature are pretty safe prayers because they do not involve any interference in the processes or order or reason of life itself. One thing I think is very important, whether it be in mentalism or in anything else, in prayer or anything that even seems to suggest a metaphysical factor anywhere in action, and that is that whatever thought we think, whatever message we send, whatever prayer we say, let us have at least one regulation on it, namely, that it be beautiful. Let it always be good. Let it always be something that if it so happened that it returned to us, we would be glad that it had returned. That there is nothing in it whatever that could be hurtful or harmful or evil. That we ask nothing of another person, exercise no influence over another person except to bless them, to wish them well, and to hope them the strength to be themselves. Asking that they do nothing for us or because we want them to, but asking only that they have the insight and the understanding to live true to their own highest principles. If we are very, very careful to keep ulterior motives out of our thinking, we do not have to live with the consequences of it sometime in the future. But just as we have taken every new and beautiful discovery that man has made and finally used it to hurt man, So even the most simple and beautiful and gracious thoughts that perhaps we start with all too often are twisted around to find some advantage for ourselves or disadvantage to others. In times of war, both armies pray for victory. In all the problems of life, we seek to call upon divine aid for the advancement of some human concern, and this advancement is nearly always selfish. So, another very safe rule in connection with all transcendentalism is to take the self out of it. I think this was the burden of Buddhism. Buddha, of course, lived in India, where the Brahmins and Hindus of his time practiced magical rites. They called upon the gods, invoked spirits, and engaged in many other things of this nature. Buddha warned against it, as did Pythagoras in Greece. He warned against it on the ground that all of these rites and rituals had something to do with the gratification of man. The individual wanted power, wealth, and security. Even when he felt like he bound some elemental to his service, as in the old legends, it was always in order to gain some gratification for his own ambitions or desires. One way to take the blackness out of magic is to take the selfishness out of it. In the ancient religions, there was a kind of wonderful divine magic, the magic of illumination, insight, and enlightenment. This mysterious and wonderful magic allowed man to come into the presence of his God, to stand in the transcendency of the divine principle, to enjoy and participate in a wonderful experience sometimes called cosmic consciousness. This kind of divine magic, in which self plays no part, is perhaps the form of the transcendent which may be permissible. But the rule, I think, is safe to follow: man is in danger whenever he is selfish. The greater the skill of his selfishness, the greater the danger he is in. If he uses any esoteric or magical means to gratify selfishness, then he is definitely practicing black magic. Black magic is perhaps not so black in itself, but opens the individual to the blackness of fear, leading him finally to a strange abyss in which he is captured by the various conspiracies he would turn against others. There can be no ultimate security in anything that is essentially selfish. So when we pray, let us pray as selfless beings, praying for the common good, not even trying to define what that good is. Perhaps we should build into the concept of our prayer, meditation, or contemplation that wonderful saying, "Not my will, but thine be done." As long as we do not impose our will upon purpose, as long as we do not stand arrogantly because our will indicates our conviction that we know when we do not know, much will be forgiven. But in our arrogance, we pitch ourselves into adversity. Therefore, our own purposes, will, appetites, instincts, and ambitions must be subservient to the great cycle of laws under which we exist. Man lives in a universe of cause and effect, under the great laws of causality, alternation, harmony, and rhythm. Man should not, under any condition, build into his life any concept which would inspire him to violate law. He should not set himself against nature. He should ask for nothing that he is not able to earn, and he should in no way attempt to force any condition in nature by which he attempts to evade that which is his natural and proper destiny. If man must pray for something, as Buddha points out, let him pray for enlightenment. Let him pray that the only desire that is desirable is the desire for truth itself, not the truth we want, but the truth that is. Not the truth we prattle about day by day, but the truth of those infinite principles which we can only dimly comprehend. We may not know what the truth is of a situation, but we have the right to inwardly pray that that truth shall reveal itself according to its own purposes, whether those purposes help us or not, whether they fulfill any desire of ours, perhaps though entirely contrary to our wishes. The thing is, what is the truth? And whatever that truth is, we must live with it and hope that in the face of truth, we will have the courage to live according to it and not according to any compromise that may arise in our own nature. From the dawn of our history, men have struggled to dominate each other, to take away the works and profits of other men. They have conquered nations and spoiled and pillaged. Everywhere, the individual tries to use strength to dominate the lives of others. By means of strength, by intimidation, by fear, by outnumbering or outwitting, the individual has tried to deprive others of their natural rights. Out of this procedure has come the entire tragedy of civilization, a tragedy which continues today as it has from the beginning. We cannot assume that any mysterious power which man may develop shall be considered as different from any material power by which an individual seeks to gain advantage over another. There is no difference except perhaps in the detailed construction of the instrument. Whether we try to take a man's goods from him with a gun or with a thought, we have committed precisely the same offense. Whenever we try to over-influence him, we are doing the same thing that we would in any action or procedure in which we lure another person into an unfavorable situation in order to cheat him. As we study the situation more carefully, we realize that just as our actions have their rewards according to their motivations and their values, the perversion of wisdom, the perversion of insight, the perversion of spiritual resource is perhaps one of the greatest crimes and carries with it one of nature's heaviest penalties. Actually, we are far worse off as living beings if we steal from a man by influencing his mind than we are if we break into his house at night and rob him of his goods. We have committed a different kind of offense. In robbery, we have used common means. Perhaps the man was careless and did not close his doors properly. Perhaps also we were using the ignorance of our own lives in which we didn't really know any better. But when we use anything that has to do with sacred matters, anything that has to do with the immediate presence of the divine in any of its aspects, we are committing a peculiar and terrible evil. Therefore, to pervert the mystical powers of meditation, concentration, and prayer carries a far heavier penalty than that of physical robbery. We have now created a situation which has gone into our psychic entity. We have dabbled with something which can destroy life, reason, and every part of our natures. Therefore, we must be extremely slow and cautious in this type of thing. Though we don't want to spend our entire time pointing out all of these mistakes that people can make, because there are other phases of this situation, we have to stop to consider the individuals who get into trouble. Many cases that come along relating to psychic problems have not really their origin in any instinctive malpractice. They have many times their origin in the individual's desperate desire to grow. He assumes that growth means for him the solution of something. He does have the one weak spot, the heel of Achilles, which has made it possible for him to get into trouble. In his desire to grow, he is usually looking for some kind of shortcut. He's looking for some kind of mysterious key that will open for him an understanding or insight otherwise not available. So he is really seeking just a little bit selfishly and just a teeny-weeny bit dishonestly, but he doesn't know it himself. He assumes in this case that the end justifies the means. He assumes that illumination is the end which man is intended to reach and that anything that contributes toward this is good, regardless of the detailed considerations involved. So, we have the individual, and it doesn't make a difference where he is or what school he belongs to. Every religious, mystical, and philosophical sect has had exactly the same difficulty from the beginning of time. Rare is the person who really believes that the esoteric truths of life are some kind of secret and that it is possible to find the key, buy it, or borrow it, somehow to get it. By means of this key, we can suddenly, to borrow a phrase from alchemy, unlock the shut door of the palace of the king. There is some way in which spirituality can be wonderfully augmented within the individual by some methodology. Years ago, we had a deluge of methodologies. Today they are not so frequent, but there are still some pretty intensive ones left. People sometimes wrongly judge these groups. They misunderstand teaching that is intended well, or perhaps the teaching itself is not well stated or well integrated and does not protect the students adequately. So we have a great many people who are in trouble simply because they are trying to be better than they know how to be, and that can get you into complications. This is one of the points that I've emphasized for very many years. The average person cannot handle the development or release of so-called metaphysical values or factors or forces within his own nature. He does not know when a development is legitimate and when it is not. He does not know where some type of mystical experience begins and some type of wishful thinking leaves off. He just does not know. He cannot really tell the difference between a vision and a dream. There's no way of knowing the difference. For that matter, he doesn't know the difference between a dream and a nightmare. There are many strange and difficult situations that the person cannot cope with. The moment his mind is separated from the commonplace landmarks about which he is reasonably certain, he wanders into a mist and mystery which he cannot evaluate. He really doesn't know what he's doing. There should not be this kind of situation. People should not be encouraged or permitted to get into these difficulties, but we can't do very much about it now because the trouble started a long time ago. Back in the gradual collapse of classical culture, the various esoteric arts and sciences of the temples were profaned. These secrets were brought out. Initiates broke their obligations, or some even, under torture, confessed or described things which they should not have discussed. In any event, little by little, what used to be a very carefully guarded way of life became available through the dishonesty or treachery of members or novices in these subjects, and the old mystery sciences came into the common possession of mankind. Of course, some good was accomplished, it wasn't all bad. From the temple, we got mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, music, geography, and history. Practically every science we know was originally part of the secret wisdom. Those sciences which we could turn and apply to the common advancements of mankind have helped. But because they were advanced without the obligations of the ancient temple, most of the secular branches of knowledge have become utterly corrupted, and all knowledge is now used selfishly. Whereas in the older times, the obligations were such that the possessors of knowledge were bound to right use. This no longer exists as a general policy unless the person, by his own high morality, makes a voluntary obligation. Some of the other, more secret and mysterious arts were brought out of their ancient symbolisms and from the early sanctuaries of the mysteries. Pandora's box was opened. All types of psychic and magical phenomena came to be a little better known and a little better understood than was wise. The great overarching science of which it was a part, the great dedications to the temple which once protected it, the long periods of purification and preparation which once led to the revelation of it, all these guards and protectors were lost. The individual was in much the same condition that we were when we discovered nuclear fission and had in our hands the greatest power that man has ever materially possessed and practically no ethical structure to direct the use of it. This was a serious situation. As far as the private citizen is concerned, the esoteric arts are just as dangerous as nuclear fission. He can get himself into a private dilemma just as easily as the world could be forced into a dilemma by an atomic war. Without the guides and guards around these practices, we developed a whole series of popular systems by which the individual really tried quite sincerely to advance his own internal life. He was convinced that somewhere inside of himself was a God, a tremendous power, and that this divine principle within him was stronger than his personality, stronger than his mind, emotions, and body. In some way, there was great security, a great sufficiency to be achieved if man could explore this inner nature of himself and come finally into union with the divine power, the source of his own being. The systems and schools were set up for the exploration of these secret processes. The theory was legitimate. The procedures were, to varying degrees, legitimate. Some quite definitely had strong good points, others had very few good points. Many of the names used to identify these systems were ancient, honorable, and belonged to great schools of the past. Some were other fabrications and profanations of the mysteries. Who knew? Who was able to tell which was genuine and which was not? Not 1 in 10,000 could become involved in these various procedures. Everybody had to believe somebody, and most people believed the wrong people. We have more trouble because of sincerity, finally, but trouble because sincerity was not very smart, not very wise in its attitude toward these matters. Every day, whenever a new system comes along, there's somebody who jumps into it, gets himself into trouble, and gives the whole theory a bad name. Always the same problem is involved. Every great system of enlightenment the world has ever known has accepted the essential inevitability of universal law. The great disciplines of the mysteries were based upon the law of cause and effect, just as much as the most common occurrences of daily life. All the great steps and stages of the development of man's inner life were the results or effects of causes. The causes had to be right, exact, and complete, or the effects would not be what was required, expected, or hoped for. In the theory of man's spiritual growth, all growth arose from the unfoldment of personal integrity. The beginning of all mystical discipline was the purification of the individual's life. Purification did not imply that the individual had to be spotless, it meant that the search for reality had to be genuine and represent a dedication to principle. It meant that the common difficulties which beset us have to be met, understood, and fulfilled according to the workings of law. Today, many people are desperately trying to develop certain extrasensory perceptions, and most of them get into trouble. They get into trouble because they do not understand how to develop anything. They have to hope, pray, follow some strange mysterious pattern, and have some kind of faith that it will work. Many times, they follow patterns given to them by others and frequently hear wonderful accounts of the secret instructions folks have received. Many of these instructions are appalling, representing colossal ignorance and effrontery on someone's part. I have checked many of these wonderful revelations on how to develop extrasensory powers, how to become an adept in 5 or 10 lessons, how to look through solid walls, see what's going on the other side, multiply the family fortune, make friends, influence people, and dominate situations. Even apart from these, there are mysterious procedures that are supposed to be shortcuts to the infinite, directing the individual to some type of illumination or mystical experience. I have tracked down many of them. Sometimes they are in pamphlets and literature, sometimes carefully guarded secrets communicated only from one person to another under direful obligations. But where did these instructions originate? I have checked many of them, and nearly all of them begin in someone else's psychic elaboration. This is 100% the case for most of them. You will finally get to the individual who was the pioneer in this particular form of the matter. Pin them down as to where they got this secret discipline that was to save the world, who told them, what secret or ancient society they belonged to, where the line of descent on this knowledge was, and where the information came from. In almost every instance, this information was something given to them in a dream, a nightmare, or a bad moment of some kind. Often, it was nothing but a slightly twisted paraphrase of something they had read. They hadn't consciously taken what they had read and passed it on as their own, but they had been reading about it for some time, and one night they dreamt about it. It got a few extra flourishes in the processes of the dream, and the next morning, a new religion was born. People, quite convinced of the sincerity of the source, and the person at the beginning probably actually rather sincere, get everyone in trouble within 6 months because the situation was not bona fide. There was nothing real. The only way the individual could get anywhere with the instructions he was receiving was to develop such a powerful imagination that he had hallucinations of progress relating to himself. He could imagine himself to be illuminated. In fact, if he was really good at it, he could have a dream in which the cosmos opened up and he found himself seated in the midst of the infinite. But the whole thing ended up in a dream, a strange negative psychic situation. You might say, if it made the person happy and didn't do anyone else any harm, and everyone seemed to be getting a little better than before, why upset the apple cart? If it went along nicely like this and everything remained happy, that wouldn't be such a bad situation. But it never goes that way. In a very short time, the false doctrines, the false ideas, and the stupid situations that arise begin to create complications. The individual thinks he is illumined and insists on illuminating other people. He doesn't know much himself, and by the time it passes on to a number of others, it's worse than when he got it. He begins to have visions of various events, frightens people to death, and has visions of what is going to happen to the universe and the political system of the neighborhood. This becomes very complicated. Little by little, he becomes a metaphysical aristocrat. there is this note of infallibility about him. After a while, he loses his family, relatives, and friends who cannot put up with the concept of an infallible person who makes as many mistakes as ever but isn't admitting them anymore. The individual doesn't discover, but others discover for him, that he has stepped out of the stream of life's experience. He has new and fancy meanings for everything that happens, meanings that are no longer of any use to him and helping him grow. One individual told me, "Why should I experience how to grow? I've already reached perfection." It's a marvelous way to feel about things, but as far as this person was concerned, they were the only one with the slightest suspicion that they had reached perfection. This same person, who was perfect, was still the same grand old gossip they had always been, had the same antagonisms, prejudices, and fanaticism, the same bad temper. The only difference was that now they justified these flaws as proofs of advancement. In short, all perspective was gone. No, this isn't helpful. The individual continues along this path until they face an emergency where the only solution would lie in the fact that they were what they thought they were, that they possessed sufficient insight and understanding to solve a major issue. When this emergency arises, the issue is not solved because they lack the necessary qualities. Sometimes, there is a very bitter disillusionment. It is a horrible thing to suddenly wake up and realize you've been studying for 20 years something that isn't true. It is very discouraging to find that, in the moment when all these things were supposed to produce their miracles, nothing happened. There are these bitter and painful experiences, and we see that the person who starts off on one of these tangents never knows where it's going to end. Unfortunately, too many of them end with mental breakdowns. They become so involved, so tied up, that they can't possibly solve the situation. Another painful reality that most of these persons face is the belief that they are right, and nobody else sees it. This is very unfortunate. They know that they are creatures of destiny, but the world won't accept them. Under such pressure, they become antisocial, turn against the world, and feel persecuted simply because others do not agree with them. This can become a serious source of emotional stress. Almost everything that arises from these false basic attitudes strips life of its simple dignities and humanities, which make things valuable. If you're not careful, you can get into trouble. Here's another general aspect of the matter which also has its problems, and that is the effect upon health. We've spoken a little about the emotional and mental stress of these situations. Now let's speak about the physical damage that can result from some of these procedures. Nearly all metaphysical practices involve a certain amount of stress. They create various kinds of fixed tensions. Most forms of concentration will do this. In time, the individual, whether they realize it or not, subjects their nervous system, particularly the autonomic system, to a tremendous amount of stress. The moment confusion is set up in our relationships with life, the nervous system begins to suffer because it is very close to fear, anxiety, uncertainty, and unreasonable health issues. The ups and downs of one moment of despair and the next moment of exaltation can disorient the individual. Believing everything one moment and nothing the next, they become more and more hypersensitive and defensive because they are increasingly misunderstood by everyone else. Little by little, their life becomes miserable and unhappy. In a reasonable length of time, the physical situation begins to reveal itself. It is very hard for a person to be under fear, anxiety, or intense imagination without punishing the body too much. These people begin to experience a lack of normal body functions. Respiration may become erratic, various forms of tachycardia may develop, and elimination may become very bad. Most of all, they may develop what I have often referred to as psychic flutters. This is an ailment almost uniquely due to psychosomatic symbolism. It is the gradual development within the personality of strange, unexplainable miseries. They report mysterious motions moving inside of them, something like nerve filaments crawling under the skin. They describe sensations resembling metaphors, cold chills, hot flashes, strange feelings moving up and down their spines, trouble swallowing, mysterious migraines, symptoms of arthritis or arteriosclerosis, palpitations, and various other distressing sensations. They are sure that these symptoms indicate the presence of some kind of strange entities tormenting them, whispering unpleasant words into their ears, disturbing their rest with dreams and visions. This is a very common group of symptoms. I could list hundreds of related symptoms in this area, but I think we have summed it up sufficiently to point out the general theme. These people believe that these symptoms signify the presence of some other entity or force affecting them. They might think these mysterious feelings are other people's thoughts bouncing off them, but as always, this type of thing is a gradual psychosomatic transference of total confusion. The individual has lost orientation. The nervous system, under such complete psychic breakdown, loses its own rhythms and orderly processes, taking on the prevailing lack of organization and integration. A large amount of psychic phenomena ends up this way. Sometimes it gets so bad that there seems to be very little you can do for it. The one thing that might help is to get the individual to change their own mental habits, but by this time, they are so convinced that they have no control over the situation. They believe only a sorcerer can get rid of the demons for them. They do not realize that these symptoms indicate the breakdown of their own natural integration. They are not mentally ill but physically disturbed. Symbolically, all the mysterious doubts, wonders, hopes, and anxieties that develop psychically are now playing themselves out nervously in the functions of the body. This is an unpleasant thing to have happen. The moment anybody feels any of these symptoms, they should stop worrying about what other people are doing to them and start organizing their own resources as quickly as they can. By organizing your own resources, I mean getting your mind on practical, workable levels of action, training your thinking, controlling your emotions through natural and reasonable outlets, and getting your mind off of being spiritual. If you don't, you're going to have more trouble. An individual in this condition is not spiritual. Therefore, whatever method has been used to get into trouble is not the method they should be following if they wish to become wise. There's no use continuing the present policy if it is obviously wrong, or the individual wouldn't be in trouble all the time. This is a problem that affects good people, people who have tried very hard but have lost a certain sense of security. They have been thrown into a universe that is too big for them, and their efforts are not enough to swim to shore quickly. Most of these people must learn to swim to shore and start all over again in the effort to establish a basic groundwork for self-improvement. We often find that other factors contribute to this situation. Nearly every religious organization, and most people involved in them, become gradually more or less unnatural in their personal ways of living, getting into trouble this way. Unfortunately, we have all kinds of trick diets and special exercises, and individuals are forcibly removed or deprived of the common expressions of life they have known for years. These individuals gradually develop various frustrations, believing that the more frustrated they are, the more spiritual they become. This is a good way to get sick quickly because the human being cannot take these inconsistent procedures without some background for them. Though it is true that every so often you will find a hermit or an old saint who went into the desert, the mountains, or the forest, built a hermitage, and lived peacefully and quietly apart from the concerns of man, practicing his Tao or Zen or yoga for half a lifetime in perfect peace and tranquility, nothing unfortunate ever happened to him. However, we are not always sure how far we know this. Nonetheless, the rumors are that he did well. This is understandable, as there are people like this in every human society. There are individuals who are born for the cloisters and are never happy until they go there. They have always wanted to live strange lives of unselfish dedication to others, finding contentment in religious service. They have no strong attachments to worldliness, find material living uncomfortable and unpleasant, and prefer a life of dedicated service to some cause. Many of these people are very useful and do wonderful jobs, generally thriving under the strong supervision of a system. They become teachers of the young, nurses of the sick, or guardians of the aged, living and functioning in their religious life through practical, commonplace labors performed in the name of their higher spiritual ideals. This often works out very well. However, imposing such restrictions on everyone most certainly leads to psychological and probably physical disorder. These people are not constituted in such a way that such a program is reasonable or practical for them. This is what happened in the development of Buddhism, where the Southern school divided from the Northern school. The Southern school taught distinctly that there was only one way to achieve illumination: to leave the world completely, utterly, and immediately, never to return. This involved turning from common life, taking the robe, giving up every possession, attachment, worldly attitude, and responsibility, and wandering with a begging bowl and one robe, meditating until consciousness or death ended the procedure. However, this was not the Buddhism that gradually unfolded the great arts, cultures, mystics, and ideals of the Mahayana system. Men came to realize that the great spiritual truths had to be brought within the range of common life. It became necessary for them to think of the way of liberation for the householder, that the father, mother, children, and business people had their part in this great pattern of enlightenment. It wasn't about leaving everything and departing into the unknown, but about finding grace, insight, and understanding in the commonplace. Grow. Sometimes, if a person had the internal requisites, brought forward from some previous life a degree of insight that called for the development of extrasensory perception, it would come in time of itself. In the Northern Buddhist system, this was the last thing anybody asked for or expected. They practiced their religion because they believed it was the proper way of life. By living well and keeping the law, they would fulfill their responsibilities to God and themselves. The purpose underlying this religious philosophy was not the unfoldment of the individual primarily, but obedience to the law, the glorification of truth by keeping its rules and principles unselfishly, not in hope of enlightenment, but because it was the proper labor of an enlightened human being. Under such conditions, we do know that great mystics arose among these groups, individuals who had slowly unfolded, lived each step of common life, grown spiritual and wise, dedicated themselves to the service of others over long periods, and gained practical insight by working with the sick and solving the problems of the burdened. They became counselors of rulers, friends of princes, helped create good laws, and perfected arts and sciences. Many contributed significantly to their peoples, like purple-dyed monks of the Shingon-shu in Japan, who were credited with as many inventions as Leonardo da Vinci in Europe. A tremendous genius, he was not merely a person who had decided to be spiritual but had worked, labored, studied, and lived with the wise. He made a long and dangerous journey to China to come closer to the great seats of the doctrines. He was a master of knowledge, one of the most perfectly informed men of his time, and still regarded as one of the most enlightened men of Asia. These people grew sincerely, giving everything they had to growth, not just for the sake of being wise themselves, but to become the founders of essential and practical movements and organizations. There were great mathematicians, artists, musicians, poets, and men of literature and letters. Out of the temples, shrines, and sanctuaries came the great arts, sculptures, and castings in bronze and silver. These people were highly skilled, believing that the more able they became in everyday life, the more completely they could express their spiritual convictions. They worked with the law and became better, realizing that the reward of being better is to know more, and the reward of greater daily virtue is enlightenment. There are no tricks in this process at all. By the time they reached the point where certain esoteric disciplines were recommended or given to them by their teachers, such as in Zen-shu, Shingon-shu, or Tendai-shu, these disciples were so well grounded in every principle of ethics and knowledgeable about the universal structure and the operations of all the laws of nature that it was virtually impossible for them to make a mistake. They had thoroughly established all the groundwork and principles. Usually, in Zen, not much of an esoteric nature was divulged until after 20 years of discipleship, which was more rigorous than we can imagine. It involved constant self-analysis and the breaking down of every illusion and delusion in consciousness. By the time the disciple was ready to go on, he had truly cleaned his inner life and was well disciplined and well ordered. People with this degree of insight can probably be trusted, and you seldom, if ever, hear of anyone at this level of activity perverting what they knew or contributing to the corruption of anyone else. These people knew and were able to use their knowledge wisely. What we are worried about constantly and stricken about so often is the dabbler, the one who really tries but simply doesn't even have a comprehension of what he's trying. To him, a few lessons and a couple of books, and he's well on his way to nirvana. It just doesn't operate that way. This does not mean, however, that the individual cannot grow. He can grow continuously, but he has to grow with dedication, not enthusiasm alone. He has to grow along the most difficult path of all, self-discipline and self-control. I know more people who have tried to be spiritual without taking hold of their own lives. They can do almost anything you can imagine except what they should be doing, which is controlling and directing their own conduct. These people are perfectly willing to devote a great deal of time to wondering about the cosmos, but they cannot be patient as people. They do not know how to be thoughtful. I know many of them, they cannot even become good neighbors. There is no attention to personal character, which is something to be left behind, to be hurdled, considered fit only for persons of less spiritual insight. There is no spiritual insight apart from character. There is no safe mystical experience apart from character. There is no possibility of a man exploring the inner universe safely unless his own integrity is completely established. Any other course of procedure is bound to lead ultimately to difficulty. Each person has to come to some way of judging these things for themselves, because only the individual knows the degree of his insight. You cannot tell someone that he isn't ready. He will keep going around until he finds someone else who tells him he is ready. This goes on because the person wants to believe that he's on the verge of enlightenment and doesn't want to be told he hasn't started yet. You can't convince people against their will. Because of this peculiar type of religious thinking that has developed, people get themselves into trouble and have no way out. By the time they realize the degree of that trouble, the very persons who got them into the trouble can't do a thing for them. They wander about, hoping for someone who can perform a miracle and rescue them from the dilemma in which they have gotten themselves. By this time, perhaps they do have a little experience that will serve them in good stead in due time, but at the moment, they are in a very uncomfortable state about the whole thing. So we can only profoundly warn the individual that when he starts dabbling with mysterious things, he must either have the consciousness to handle them or he should leave them alone. No one who is frightened out of his wits by every psychic wind that blows is in a condition to benignly solve the problem. No one who has to seek help is in a condition to handle it. Therefore, if this situation seems to be developing, there can be only one answer: get out of it as quickly as you possibly can and get your feet back on the ground again. Use the simple ways. Realize that this whole problem of trying to curb psychic environments is only possible because, basically, the person is not capable of thinking with true wisdom. Somewhere, weaknesses in his old have contributed to the fact that he was deceived or has deceived himself. It has to start with this. From a point on, our perspective can be lost, and the situation can just be a long, terrible hurt with no really satisfactory explanation. But in the beginning, the person had to be foolish, and the only answer is to stop being foolish as quickly as you can. There are ways in which some of the damage in this area can be rescued, or the individual can be pulled out of this problem. We realize that as the problem gets worse, as the individual advances in some form of psychic persecution, which is more and more difficult than to get off of his own mind, he is inevitably becoming the Reich is becoming fear, and even if he hasn't reached a degree of elucidation, it may come any moment. He is certainly actually frightened as living in fear. The whole thing has become a phobia, and this phobia is nursed by fear. The more worries about his fears, the more he thinks about his fears, the more waits for new symptoms to appear. The more frightened he will become, and if this goes on, especially if the individual is alone, perhaps living alone. Well, there is very little contact with other people, too much loneliness to begin with, which may have been a contributing cause in the first place. Then this person must either make a valiant break with the situation where he finds himself, or he will not get out of the difficult, and unfortunately it is not a difficulty that will cure itself, nor will it get better unless something is done about it. Realizing therefore that, as in the case of nearly all forms of neurosis which may come from other causes, there is too much self-attention, the mind and emotions are focused upon the dilemmas of the self constantly. This means that little by little it becomes a 24-hour vigil of psychic self-defense against the unknown. Individual doesn't dare sleep, he doesn't dare do anything. Of this constantly increasing pressure of fear, or pressure that is usually accompanied by psychosomatic symptoms that seems so real that there is no way apparently of explaining them except to assume that the psychic persecution is real itself. Under this combination we have a hard vicious circle which is extremely difficult to break. The best way that we can solve it is by starting out with the assumption that a pattern is no stronger than its weakest link. The situation is a pattern if we can break it somewhere. We perhaps can break it everywhere if we can just put new factors into the problem, or take all factors out of it if we can shift the point of view. If we can change the psychic chemistry in some way, then the individual may be able to handle it himself from their own. So we have common things that we try to do to help people of this in this type of problem. We try to find out anything that they are doing that is unnatural, unreasonable, or likely to contribute to the trouble. If these people are starving themselves to death in the name of religion, we suggest a square meal, but better be taken slowly, because otherwise they may have dyspepsia. If these individuals have been practicing some form of syncopated breathing or something of this nature, they must stop it, or the situation will not change. If these people have left the world because it is so material as they can, so unspiritual that it is constantly hurting their very, very subtle etheric bodies, we suggest already they're back in the world and re-establish contact, that they've got to get out and get back in the good old world vibrations again, because the high ones are killing them. If these people have no interest in life whatsoever except waiting for the next psychic phenomena, we strongly recommend other interests, and we particularly recommend some form of activity which disciplines. If these people are retired on an income, or are divorced and living on alimony and don't have to work, they're in an especially bad spot. These people have to decide that they have to work. They have to come to the conclusion that no matter what they have or how much security they enjoy, they will destroy themselves if they are not usefully occupied. We find them the importance of these people training some part of their natures, and the result shows how badly this training is needed, for so frequently these people are completely unable to take up any line of self-discipline without a massive struggle. These individuals cannot go back to school and take some adult education work. It's too monotonous. In other words, they cannot say to themselves, I expect to do this, and I will do it. It's part of the very evidence of the trouble they got into, but you've got to get them out of it. They have to have new interests, new activities, practical outlets. They have to take up studies. They have to discipline themselves. If you go to play the piano, you discipline yourself. If you're suffering from a bad psychological or psychic condition, if you're unable to control these vibrations that may or may not be entities, it is simply because of lack of discipline. If you will discipline yourself somewhere, it will show all over you. Therefore, if we can get this individual to never made up their own mind clearly on any subject in their entire lives, but who thinks they're just on the suburbs of heaven, if you can get this individual to go out and study music for 5 years, doing scales for the first 3, and then insisting that their own hands and their own minds will do this, or if you can get them into a group of Sema fingers and make them learn to make circles and bamboo joints on paper with black ink for 3 years before they're allowed to put a leaf on them. These people get well. Why? Because they have suddenly learned that they can make their minds and emotions do what is required of them. The person becomes positive. He has some accomplishment. He has some ability in the you, who usually takes from 1 to 3 months for a discipline to become a fascinating thing. The first 2 or 3 months is drudgery, but if a person really has some qualities within his own nature, he will develop a growing interest in the new things that are of interest or value to him. So if he can hold on for 2 or 3 months, the subjects will probably take over a large part of his habit mechanism. It will then go on and find that he has learned how to learn. If he will do this and gradually develop disciplines, he will then be able to turn these disciplines to the direct problems that are troubling him. He will find that he is able to control fear in himself. He will be able to control his own spiritual ambitions, and realize that he's probably not quite ready for nirvana. He will be able to recognize that it is possible for him to go home into an empty house perhaps and build there a world of interesting values, because he has become an interesting person. It is from ourselves that the environment in which we live must radiate. If we are negative, the environment is negative in affixes. If we are dynamic in ourselves, the environment in which we find our daily living becomes itself a dynamic source of inspiration. Everywhere the individual achieves his spiritual integration by becoming master of his own instincts, appetites, impulses, and fears. So, if we can create in the person new interests, if we can cause this person to become more concerned over someone else than himself. But in 2 or 3 cases of this spiritual problem, in which the individual was suddenly transformed by a non-avoidable responsibility, they suddenly realized they had a duty that had to be performed. They rose magnificently to this responsibility, and the psychic problem vanished instantly. But there has to be something bigger than our fears. If we start correctly with philosophic growth, truth is always bigger than our fears. But too many people live in a universe in which truth is lost the moment we start believing in forces of evil persecuting us for no reason. We have betrayed our own faith in the universe. There is no other answer, but we do not know this. We can't think it through anymore. We've lost our perspective. We're simply third, and where we are hurt there is no justice. We have to restore these values. We have to straighten them out and build again a pattern of positive conviction of which we can live. If we can voluntarily reassume responsibilities that we have attempted to avoid, this will also help. It's like the young man who comes into me and he says, I am not getting any discipline at home. I'm no graduating from high school. I think the only thing for me to do is to commit myself to the Navy for 3 years. We'll see what they can do with me. This man says if I don't do this, I will never be able to discipline myself. So perhaps for this young man the Navy is the perfect thing, because at least he will come out being able to say yes sir and no sir, which is more than the average person can do. We will also know that when an order is given, evil obey, which the average child has not discovered. he also realizes that he's part of a team. If he betrays the team, he is pretty much of a scope-insulated life. We don't know this. I have known several instances where young men have done this and have come back a credit to themselves, and their families would otherwise have been on straight and probably in delinquency from lack of discipline and direction. So when we have a person who finds himself slipping into a negative psychic condition, we have the same thing: put yourself under discipline. I doubt if the Navy would be interested, but there are other things you can do. You can create your own discipline, and you can say to yourselves, if I fail in this, then I know for certain just how weak I am and how far I am from the thing I think I am. Get these things very straight and very firm in ourselves, and we can generally defeat this psychic problem even after it's settled in. But we can never defeat it by trying to use magic against magic. With the bigger the invocations and formulas and charms we make, the bigger the other side makes. And if we have the simple charm, they have the super charm, and so it goes on to infinity, because we are dealing with a thing so abstract, so elusive in its own proportions, that we will never know whether we have one or not under these conditions. The only answer is to take hold of the matter. If you are not in that kind of trouble, stay out of it, and be grateful that it has been your wonderful privilege to be able to grow without seeing things. If you are seeing things, either have your eyes attended to immediately, or begin to dig into basic systems of thinking that are going to give you a dynamic, vital, meaningful pursuit in life. And under no condition, if you are miserable, unhappy, defeated by life, run to some form of psychic phenomena for escape, because it is escape only into misery if you can keep these thoughts. Grab a clarion mind. I think you will realize why it is not good to dabble with this sort of thing from an experimental stage. It is very foolish. It is like experimenting with poisonous serpents, or experimenting with some deadly material that is liable to explode in your face at any moment. Do not experiment. Do not play games with life. But realize that if you really want to make philosophy your journey, as Porteno said, build a solid knowledge supporting a well-disciplined, well-integrated character. Then, as you naturally grow and properly develop, any spiritual bracers that you may require for your proper growth will be added unto you in due season, and this way you won't have any trouble. Copyright 2024 by FreeBooksTube. Thank you for listening. Please consider to subscribe, like, and share to help the channel growth. New videos on a daily basis.